Welcome, everyone. I'll be happy to kick off our event today entitled The Path Forward, Climate Inclusion and Indigenous Reconciliation. My name is David Bilodeau. I serve as the Senior Director of Natural Resources, Environment, and Sustainability here at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. While we're meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to begin today's discussion by recognizing the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on, from coast to coast to coast. I want to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people and celebrate the importance of the land that we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. On behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I would like to thank Deloitte for partnering with us today as we continue to foster reflection and action on reconciliation. Our discussion today is centered around the principle that a sustainable future for Canada hinges on environmental stewardship and on healing the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It is of particular importance to understand that these are interconnected efforts and goals. So to examine these topics, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. First, we are joined by Anne-Marie Etier. Anne-Marie is a partner with Deloitte, a recognized fellow CPA. She leads the municipal practice for NCR in Quebec and is the national AA leader on Deloitte's Indigenous Committee. Anne-Marie is a community builder with the many boards she is on, a mother, a friend, and we're very pleased to have her join us for today's discussion. Second, we're joined by Jason Razovich. Jason is a partner with Deloitte and serves as the company's national Indigenous Client Services Lead. Jason has deep knowledge of Indigenous rights and the resource sector through his involvement in complex negotiations between First Nations, industry, and government. And he has 20 years of marketing, finance, strategy, governance, and economic development experience with various First Nations across Canada. Jason, thank you for being with us today. To kick off our discussion, I'll turn to each of our speakers to provide a bit more about their background, as well as opening remarks to help us set the stage for our discussion. And Jason, if we could please turn to you to kick us off. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for the land acknowledgement and those remarks. And I'm very pleased to be here today with my colleague Anne-Marie to bring this discussion of climate and Indigenous relations forward to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Nice to be involved in this discussion. And before I begin, I'd like to provide a little bit of local land acknowledgement or information where I'm calling in from today through this telecast or webcast from Thunder Bay, Ontario, and pay my respects to the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation and the Anishinaabe of Robinson Superior Treaty 1850. I'm been with Deloitte for just over a year and a half now of advancing some of these discussions related to integration of reconciliation with corporate Canada, Indigenous communities and government. And I've got a background in this field, but also I'm a Gunuguming First Nation community member that has experience at the community level and then regionally negotiating large projects. A lot of, I guess, my experience with land relationship comes to my upbringing and spiritual beliefs of being raised out on the land and with relatives and family through our traditional practices and through a trap line system and so forth. So I'm very pleased to be here to share some insight. Miigwech.
Thanks for that, Jason. Anne-Marie, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm also very pleased and proud to be part of this discussion today with my colleague Jason on climate inclusion and reconciliation. Thank you to the Chamber of Commerce of Canada to invite us. Again, my name is Anne-Marie Etier. I am talking to you from the territory of, I am from Maniwaki, and I'm a proud member of the Kiligan-Zibi Indigenous community of the Algonquin First Nation, and I'm talking to you from the Algonquin territory. I have more than 25 years of experience in public accounting, including more than 12 years as partner at Deloitte. I provide assurance and advisory services to not-for-profit and public sector organizations, as well as private companies. I am also an ambassador for Deloitte's Reconciliation Action Plan that was unveiled in June 2020, and I sit on the firm's Indigenous Market Leadership Committee. Throughout my career, I have served as a director and volunteer on several boards of directors and executive committees with various business, professional, and charitable organizations. I am currently the chair of the board of directors of the Laval Chamber of Commerce. And starting June 1st, I will be also a Deloitte Canada and Chile board member. So thank you for having me today.
Well, thank you. So maybe before we get rolling, just a quick note to the audience. Please feel free throughout our discussion today to use the chat function to pose questions to our speakers. I'll be happy to take those up towards the end of our call. And to kind of help set the table for our discussion, and maybe before we start discussing opportunities for climate action, inclusion, and reconciliation, I think it's important to support an understanding of Crown Indigenous relations, legacy issues, as well as current relational dynamics between Indigenous communities and the private sector. So to that end, I'm hoping that we could hear from our speakers some insights on historical and modern considerations on reconciliation as it relates to sustainable economic development and environmental stewardship. And maybe with that one, I can turn to Jason first.
Sure. Thanks for the question, David, and really appreciate the opportunity to set the tone here. I believe with what's happening now within the trends of ESG and indigenizing ESG and what we're seeing in the business climate related to reconciliation, there is a foundation of learning that is going to be a requirement for corporate Canada as well for society. And what we're seeing in this regard, and it comes from the discussion that First Nations peoples have been here since time immemorial, and they've been involved in land management far before the Constitution, far before the doctrine of discovery of this country, and that there is an inherent ancestral responsibility to the land. And from those types of ideas, we always hear, the rights-based focused. And if we're thinking of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we see that we're stepping into a new paradigm related to economic development and business sustainability because of some of the legislative drivers that are forcing this discussion for corporate boards to consider climate and Indigenous relations and an alignment between the two. And that is not just from a legislative area of, we see it in BC with the UNDRIPA becoming law, and in Canada, Bill C-15 also being adopted. But Indigenous peoples for a long time have been seeking their rights through the legal system. And over 300 Supreme Court of Canada victories over the last 30 years has provided a stronger position that is changing the landscape. But now we're not only seeing that in the regulatory environment, in the permitting environment, but also the requests from investors and shareholders that are asking companies how they're measuring their relationship with Indigenous peoples and how they're mitigating any type of risk related to advancing projects on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to set that type of framework and to also bring forward the aspect of treaty and honoring treaty commitments between Crown governments and First Nations as well.
Thank you for that, Jason. And maybe turning to Anne-Marie for comments now.
Yeah, maybe I can add to what Jason was saying about, we've seen evolution, even myself with the beginning of my career, working with my dad in Maniwaki for more than 10 years. And then after, when I joined Deloitte, I've been able to see the evolution of our businesses and institution and understanding and building a more inclusive Canada. And since I'm working with mid-market clients and First Nations for many years now, I've been able to see the progression on how we are working together. I also think that each of us, depending on who we are, our roots and our own family history, we have also our own path to reconciliation, and we see the evolution of that as well. The reconciliation process is there to restore trust and rebuild our relationship with Indigenous people. And it's one way which corporate Canada can help to make a positive and meaningful impact on our country. And I really think that at Deloitte, we know that, and we can do more. We need to learn, continue to learn, to take action. And this is why I'm so proud of being part of our Indigenous Leadership Committee and be part of the development of our Reconciliation Action Plan.
And I'm hoping to, Jason, do you have a, okay, sorry. I'm hoping we can talk more about the Deloitte Reconciliation Action Plan momentarily, but perhaps sticking with this theme about where Canada's going. Are we improving relational dynamics? Are we achieving or moving towards reconciliation? I'd like to kind of focus in a bit more on the business aspect of reconciliation now broadly across Canada. So the 90-second call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is focused on the role of the private sector in reconciliation. And specifically, it was recommended that Canada adopts the United Nations Direct Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a, quote, reconciliation framework, and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources, unquote. These calls to action were published, roughly 10 years ago now. So with that kind of timeline in mind, I suppose my question is, how has the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada's private sector developed in this time? And how do you see, and do you see any major opportunities or concerns within the current landscape? And maybe Anne-Marie, if we can turn to you first.
Well, thank you, David. As you mentioned, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, led bare the truth and challenge each of us to play our part in reconciliation. And we know that Deloitte can and must play a leadership role there, as all the Canada, the business in Canada. And for Deloitte, we had presented our plan, and we act and report on it as we are accountable for delivering on what we have committed to. Deloitte has answered and acknowledged the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as an international human rights framework that recognizes and protects the unique and collective rights of Indigenous peoples around the world. So our Reconciliation Action Plan is fact guided by the Declaration purpose and principles. So over the years, I've been able to see opportunities when advising clients, and maybe Jason after will be able to add on my comments. But particularly, when we talk about planning strategies that include land, water, air, climate, we all need to understand the history and the truth of this land and begin the process of reconciliation. So, for example, companies have traditionally come to Indigenous leaders to at least at the last step of the process of seeking approvals for projects that impact lands, rather than consulting with them at first step to understand the impact of their project, what the impact could be, and the mitigation that can be put in place. So this is something that, there's opportunities there for us to be better on that case. Other examples, if you're looking around the management table, who are there to represent and be the voice of Indigenous people. And we're talking about also gender, ethnicity, but you know, we need to bring also Indigenous voices around the table. And other opportunities I can see as well is all about learning, because it's so important for us to learn. And I can think about my own experience with our 4 seasons of reconciliation training that was offered at all our employees and families for the past year. My experience was even for myself an eye-opening for me and for many of us, and I really think that we need to continue to learn and share to be able to you know, to create those opportunities, but also to understand more and work better together. Jason, I'm sure you have something to add around what I'm saying.
Yeah, I really liked your comments on how you framed out the evolution of where we're going and provided examples of how companies are being more inclusive. And when I think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, or even the term reconciliation, it could mean it could mean many things to different segment groups. And you have corporations that have been operating in this country for a long time who have developed wealth on the lands and resources of First Nations peoples, where First Nations have been marginalized by legislation and a colonized way of doing business. And when I think of that term reconciliation, to me, it is a call for decolonization of corporate Canada. So we see a lot of the Reconciliation Commission's work, and a lot of companies say, well, this is government's job to reconcile. But specifically, Call to Action 92 is specifically asking corporations in Canada to be accountable. And not just corporations that are impacting lands and resources and the rights of First Nations peoples, but also are operating in municipalities, urban centers, and big cities, where there are calls to action that could impact a company's marketing power, ability to attract investment. So that's, you know, really important related to specific Call to Action 92, because what I feel is we're moving from an era of duty to consult and accommodate to an era now of consent and permission to move forward with specific projects. And I guess related to those rights that are constitutionally protected rights related to duty to consult, Section 35 rights, there's also Aboriginal treaty rights that individual community members have, and also collectively nations have, that are also a part of the discussion of honoring treaties. And when treaties are signed between Crown governments and First Nation leaders, you know, it was signed in a way to share in the lands and resources. And it's an evergreen agreement. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows, this will remain intact. So what we're seeing now, you know, related to this evolution is more education that's happening in society, because this curriculum wasn't in the mainstream education systems. And we're seeing companies that are taking more of an effort to train and educate some of their employees, some of their boards, to understand all this aspect of what has happened in the past and transpired to create this company, or their company, or this country, and how we can find ways to be more inclusive of Indigenous peoples in the supply chain, in the company's hiring processes, and to consider policy that needs to be addressed to support an environment of decolonizing and creating an atmosphere of supporting and driving reconciliation.
And maybe I'll just pull on this thread a bit more. Jason, you mentioned Canada's currently operating with a colonized way of doing business. And Anne-Marie, you mentioned that it's vital to bring Indigenous voices to the table in terms of corporate operations, and with the understanding that, Canada's corporate boardrooms have an issue with diversity and inclusion, or a historical issue with diversity and inclusion. Do you see material efforts across industry to make senior leadership positions more open, more inclusive, more available for Indigenous peoples, for females, so on? I'm just wondering if you can provide a bit of context around that. Are we heading in a more positive direction?
Maybe I can start, Jason, on that one. I think that we still have a lot of work to do around that. As corporate Canada, on many, it was International Women's Day this week. There's a lot of things that still need to be done to make sure that we do have the right representation on our boards and in our management and leadership in Canada, in corporate Canada. But I see openness. I see that more and more we're doing things and we're learning in order to have the right representation and have more specifically, Indigenous voices at the representation in the management committee. And also at the boards. But we still have a lot of work to do. And this is why it's so important that we continue to talk about it, but also that we act as corporate Canada. Jason, not sure if you have something.
Yeah, I agree that we've got a long way to go, and that there are certain measures and systems that are being put in place that are increasing the discussion at the board director level to consider not just the interests of the corporation in creating shareholder value or shareholder wealth, which has been the way that corporations have been, structured and supported, throughout this era, but now are looking to consider other topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's impacting their market position, their brand, and potentially investment and social license. And that social license coming from a broad variety of groups and stakeholders, but also Indigenous partners that are not considered stakeholders. Indigenous partners are rights holders, not stakeholders. So there's an entire shift in how we're thinking about identifying risk, how we're addressing that whole matrix of attracting investment, and how companies and boards are going to need to report on all of the aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and climate, and potentially of a new shift of reporting on how they're valuing and measuring the relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada based off of these legislative drivers and the trends that are happening. One other point on the entire atmosphere of where corporations, and directors are headed is definitely, there's more value and more views that are being brought into that corporate discussion to de-risk how we move forward from a sustainability perspective, but to also support more diverse boards where there's actually a seat there for an Indigenous person to be able to provide a voice to the company and a perspective to eliminate groupthink and to also provide a lens on some of the topics that the board may not be familiar with.
Well, thanks for that. And I think that's a really good segue to my next question for both of you, which is focused on Deloitte's Reconciliation Action Plan. That document notes that Deloitte's purpose is making an impact that matters with our people, our clients, and our communities. So I hope that you'd both provide a bit of context on the rationale for Deloitte's leadership in this space, as well as some of your organization's recent activities and how Deloitte intends to advance its action plan going forward. And Anne-Marie, maybe if I could turn to you for this one.
Yes, I've been part of the team who developed the plan since the beginning. And it was really when we start, it was people from across the country, some Indigenous people, but also, all market leaders and people from the all across service line that were able to put together a plan that would be in place to make sure that we do act on what we're saying. And we wanted to be more than, we wanted to be bold, and we continue to want to be bold. So that's why we've put in place our plan. And in 2020, we did unveil it, and there's 4 pillars to our plan. There's inclusion, education, employment, and economic empowerment. And what we have done is really we have put in place some mechanism and process to be able to evaluate and refresh that reconciliation action plan every 2 years. But in the meantime, we track our progress with our committee monitor monthly our activities. We measure our success against objectives every year, as well as we report at our board and our executive very frequently. We just provided an update last week, I think, to some of our committees and leadership executive. And we do share as well annual report. The last one was done in June 2021. That was the first one. And some examples of where we're leading the way, I think, at Deloitte is really we do have our governance representation. We have already one external member who's an Indigenous and is really providing us with our experience and all our thoughts around what we need to do. And if we're talking, she's adding a lot to our discussion, I would say, at the board level. I will be joining the board on June 1st as well. We have also a lot of promotion of learning and growth through many things that we're doing, like the mandatory 4-season reconciliation training that is available. We also have sponsored various learnings activities with our people, including presentation by several of our Indigenous leaders like Jason. We developed some point of view as well, and some partnership with First Nation organizations in order to be able to present jointly some of our discussions. And our executive team have participate to some Kairos blanket exercise program where we explore relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. We have also created a lot of relationship with external stakeholders and like-minded organizations to collaborate on opportunities that support Canada reconciliation journey. We've teamed with many organizations like Sodexo, Catalyst, Volunteer Canada, Dalhousie University, Deloitte Podium Club of Canada, where Jason just had a speech a few days ago. And we want to make sure that we're part of roundtables and webinars where we can provide our point of view, but also lead the discussion. And this is part of our plan as well. We're building a team of leaders that I'm very proud of to work with, and I'm learning every day from Indigenous partners and senior leaders from across the country who's joining our team of leadership and bringing value to our plan, but also to what we're doing every day, and creating and making impact and moment that matters. And maybe the other thing I could mention is we're proud member of the CCAB, where we participate in their Progressive Aboriginal Relationship program, and we oversight as well a lot of suppliers and partnership relationship to ensure we're walking the talk. I think this is really important for us, and this is why we put in place all those mechanisms to make sure that we are accountable and we are delivering on our plan, and we're adjusting our plan as well because we're still learning. Jason?
Fantastic. And I appreciate the kind of leadership Deloitte's showing in this space. And as someone who reads sustainability reports for fun, I suppose, I hope to see more of a proliferation of this sort of action and reflection in the Canadian private sector going forward. Jason, any remarks on the Reconciliation Action Plan before we kind of move on?
Yeah, just I think Anne-Marie hit a lot of those points within the pillars, and it's been quite the journey. And I will say it is a journey and something that we're in the early stages of moving on that pathway to change 150 years of business systems that of how we've been operating as a firm. To change that, in a short period of time, it's going to take time. And it's going to take commitment, and it's going to take internal discussions. It's going to take that process of decolonizing the corporate culture of the board management and having education happen. And the 13,000 practitioners within the firm, we've got over 80% that are taking the 4 seasons of reconciliation training through their onboarding, and we require that as a policy within the orientation. But we've got big plans to indigenize the firm, where we're bringing in Indigenous experts and professionals to be able to contribute to where the firm's going as a direction. But it is, a big movement, and it does take time, and really inspired to see us walking the talk. One other area from a companies we keep principle is we definitely are assessing our strategic alliances and also projects that we work on, and whether or not we want to participate on it, of it being in support of reconciliation, and we're quick to walk away from projects that may impact the rights of Indigenous people. So we're seeing that from a risk perspective of ensuring that that we're walking on that pathway, and that we're walking the talk, as Anne-Marie said.
That's great, and maybe picking up on a remark from the previous question that Jason made about rights holders versus stakeholders. I'd want to turn our attention to future and immediate opportunities to support, the interconnected goals of climate action and reconciliation. So I think the Chamber and our audience would be particularly interested in hearing your views on the role of Indigenous peoples in Canada's net zero strategy and critical minerals strategies, as these are kind of, top of mind in a lot of economic development discussions in Canada right now. Perhaps focusing first on net zero, the federal government, of course, has committed to decarbonizing Canada's economy by 2050, and our 2030 emissions reductions plan is due out later this month. So I suppose with net zero in mind, my question is twofold. How will Canada's net zero pathway impact Indigenous communities? And what are the opportunities to incorporate both Indigenous leadership and knowledge to support our transition to a low carbon economy? I'm just wondering if you can kind of share your thoughts on that one.
Sure, I'll hop in first with a comment. Definitely, it's a discussion that has happened in Indigenous communities for a long time, related to environmental concerns and climate change. And with climate change, Indigenous peoples have been part of the first segment of the population that's been impacted by wildfires, by flooding, or by other issues that have impacted communities with global warming. And it's timely that we're having this discussion today. We've just released a point of view on alignment of climate change mitigation and Indigenous reconciliation, and how there's an intersect there in alignment. And it's the report will be released in a few weeks, but there's an article that's been published today, and the report is called Promises, Promises, Canada's Commitment to the Climate and Indigenous Reconciliation. So that's coming out very soon in the next week. That will focus on some thought leadership from some of those that are directly involved in some of these discussions. How climate and this discussion is impacting Indigenous peoples, and how it has in the past from the right holder's perspective, is within that duty to consult framework. There's been the environmental assessment processes that companies have utilized to get permits to advance their project development, or to utilize the lands and resources from First Nations traditional lands, whether that be minerals and surface rights, whether that be forests and the fiber from communities' traditional lands, or even water and other energy generation projects. And what is happening now from shifting from that permitting and the regulatory side of things is, how can Indigenous traditional knowledge be more integrated in not just land use plans, but we think of the concept of a land relationship plan, of just the terminology that we're utilizing to develop these types of systems and framework for getting Indigenous peoples involved in that discussion as early as possible, to ensure that Indigenous traditional or ecological knowledge and wisdom is a part of that decision-making process. And we haven't always seen that in the past. And that's because the regulatory regime and environment is years behind where we're going as far as the UNDRIP and the consent-based framework. But it's something that has impacted Indigenous peoples for a long time, and it has usually led to either litigation or blockades if there's issues with permitting and approvals that don't support an Indigenous engagement process where they're involved in that discussion. So we're seeing a lot of advancement in that area, but we still got a ways to go related to some of the issues that are there across Canada because of the different jurisdictions and different provinces.
And, kind of building on that is the critical minerals strategy that Canada is slowly developing. So to your point about ensuring Indigenous stakeholders and knowledge are incorporated from the outset of strategic plans and project development, here we have Canada looking to rapidly develop critical mineral value chains in the coming years, not only to kind of feed domestic markets, but also to provide those building blocks for clean and digital infrastructure to global markets. So maybe a bit of context for the audience on critical minerals. The demand for these minerals are obviously going to increase in the coming years, especially as we decarbonize. So for example, an average electric vehicle requires 6 times the amount of minerals as a conventional car, and also requires materials not usually included in a conventional vehicle. So recognizing that most mineral deposits are in northern communities, the growing importance of these critical minerals, and Canada's economic opportunities in this space, I would appreciate your insights on how Canada's emerging critical minerals strategy can potentially create transformative economic opportunities that facilitates Indigenous partnerships, reconciliation, and self-determination. Is that possible within Canada's developing critical minerals strategy?
really depends on the willingness of where some of the, I guess, governments within the provinces that have the authority over lands and resources and making certain decisions, whether for example, when we're specifically talking about the mining sector and the Mining Act, there's definitely challenges with the legislation that's in place across certain jurisdictions and provinces that are counter to reconciliation that could be improved with incorporating a timeline and process to include the Indigenous voice within the decision making and the environmental assessment. Also, from that perspective, there is an opportunity, though, if we're going to be looking to drive partnerships and have these types of discussions Indigenous led, there is an opportunity to support the industry of the critical minerals market. When we think of that from a decarbonization perspective, we've got projects that are being proposed across Canada on First Nations traditional territories that will require their support and social license to advance. So from a perspective of bringing projects to communities and looking for an agreement or social license, there's going to need to be a discussion far early or more advanced in the process as possible to be able to develop a relationship with the Indigenous people and an understanding of what their aspirations are to participate in the project in order to get the green light to move forward on a true partnership that what we're hearing involves equity and ownership as well. And a project that considers greenhouse gas emissions, considers impacts to the environment, it considers impacts to the air and to the water and to the cultural way of life and traditional way of life of Indigenous peoples. That's all going to be an important part of consent and moving projects forward, and having First Nations on boards or decision-making committees or processes that lead to that outcome is going to be crucial. The other part is many critical minerals that are on the radar for the electric vehicle battery market, this proposed $1 trillion market, are found in remote areas like Northern Ontario, where there's amounts of nickel and lithium. And from early projections, there's reports that we're going to need 10 times more nickel and 14 times more lithium in order to supply the electric vehicle battery market. That's going to change the buying patterns of consumers and supplying consumers with electric vehicles in order for us to reach our net zero goals by 2050. So Indigenous peoples will have a major role to play, not just the mining sector, but in other projects where industries are being asked to decarbonize. And also there's another aspect of nature-based climate solutions that Indigenous knowledge is bringing into the equation, and how we can make better land management and land relationship decisions to support where we need to go as a country.
Well, thanks for that. And those are the questions that I had for our speakers today. And perhaps we can spend the next bit of time answering a few questions. I see in the chat we have a few lined up from our audience. So I'll open it up to both of our speakers to respond. And maybe the first one I'll pick from is, how does a company work with First Nations when no treaty exists and we desire true partnership, but a framework is not in place? Any thoughts on that question?
I'll jump in with the response. I'm assuming this question is about communities that either are negotiating a modern treaty or it's unceded territory, and there's communities that are very advanced in developing a leadership team and structure to be able to get involved and engaged in that discussion. And I guess a tip for that, or potential ideas, is to set out a cadence of understanding the community's values and who some of the key decision makers are. At times, government directs companies or potential businesses to certain individuals without perhaps understanding who some of the key leadership peoples are at the community level. And it all goes to asking the right questions, not pursuing a specific timeline that's business-like or orientated or regulatory in nature. It centers around some of the basic human principles of building that relationship and connection. And from my experiences, I've heard a lot of elders speak and chiefs and leaders speak about some of the challenges that they have related to responding to that timeline because they're in a crisis situation. When we think of what we've had to deal with in society related to the pandemic and related to some of the global issues that are happening, for example, what is happening with Russia and Ukraine, a lot of communities are often dealing with community crisis and having to engage with a proponent on a project or with a business opportunity. At times, it isn't the priority at the community level. So we need to consider where the community's at, what resources they have available, and it's difficult at times to not think of the time as value or time and money situation, but we really need to be patient with developing the relationship. And the comments that I've heard is the 1,000 cups of tea principle of not trying to rush into signing documents and to be there to listen, to learn, and to think about the aspirations of the community, because we see within that culture that that there could be all the time in the world, and the Western way of approaching development is all based off of this clock and this time frame of days for moving forward an agreement. But much of that thinking does not work at the community level.
Yeah, again, I think it's all about building trust. Like Jason saying, take the time to listen and having those discussions at the right pace. So everyone can feel that they bring and they have the right conclusion of those questions.
Great. So I'm again just looking at the chat here, and hopefully we can kind of dig into Deloitte's reconciliation action plan a bit more with the following question, focused on strategic partnerships. So the question is, wouldn't Deloitte's highest leverage activity be to not just lead at a firm level, but also to rally a coalition of the leading organizations to advocate for new, better mandatory legislation? So with that question, perhaps could you talk about the partnerships Deloitte's forming in this space, and perhaps some of the advocacy initiatives that you might be involved in as part of the Reconciliation Action Plan?
I think this is part of our plan, actually, to build those relationships and to build the partnership with the organization that would be able to help us have Corporate Canada really rally everyone to this to do the same as we're starting to do and respond to the Truth and Reconciliation request, but also and maybe Jason can talk a little bit more about some partnership we have done recently, but it's really for us part of what we want to do is to make sure that we have built those relations and lead the way and be part of the discussion as well.
When we think of the strategic alliance, part of it and what we can do to rally a coalition or whatnot, the thought, it really needs to be Indigenous led and grassroots led as well. So we've got a major role to play from a professional standpoint, but also a supporting standpoint and a supporting role. Definitely, we've got a role to play on the influence as well on corporate Canada and government related to some of the accounts that we work with, but related to that guidance and the direction of where the strategic alliance partners that are First Nations or Indigenous led would like to go. There's a lot of discussion that needs to happen in order to socialize that directive and that mandate, and ensuring that it actually supports local, regional groups and potentially translating across the national groups. There's over 630 First Nations across Canada and many other groups that are within this landscape of shift. And there is no cookie cutter approach or one window approach to working in this industry. Each community has their own autonomy. Each community and the individuals are rights holders, and they have certain views and perspectives related to how they see the future state of our country, the future state of our economies. That's based off of their culture and views. And working with them in that aspect is really important. But those strategic alliance partners need to also share the same value system, related to climate, related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and supporting this environment of having Indigenous-led approaches and businesses within certain supply chains. So a lot more that we can unpack in that comment, but I'll leave it there for now.
Well, that's perfect. And just cognizant of time, I'll read one more question from the audience, and I'll save a very loaded question for last, of course. So Jason, perhaps picking up on the importance of Indigenous-led approaches, the comment here is very interesting. So we aren't making progress at the pace and scale needed. Voluntary approaches aren't going to get us where we need to go fast enough. Additional mandatory requirements, including regulations and policies, will help. So I'm just wondering if we can have a quick discussion and kind of share insights on the nature of voluntary kind of corporate involvement in this space versus perhaps increased regulatory presence to spur action here, and how you see that dynamic working out in the years ahead.
Well, it's an interesting comment, and related to where corporate Canada needs to go with from a policy perspective. And I think one of the ways that we're getting into that discussion is definitely in the ESG perspective of corporate disclosures, and some of the challenges that exist today within the frameworks for ESG, like SASB, and that impacts some of the credit rating agencies like Moody's and so forth, is Indigenous people's concerns do not hit a company's ratings until litigation happens, and that's counterproductive to reconciliation and where we need to go as a country. So there needs to be better standards and frameworks put into place that impact the capital markets and investment into corporate Canada structures for business expansion and growth that consider Indigenous people's views, not just in the S component of ESG, because we see a lot of companies try to fit or pigeonhole Indigenous peoples in the S component, when the Indigenous peoples part of it is way more broad. There's the environmental impacts that I mentioned, the environmental discussions of how that could happen, and then the social procurement side of things and social support, and the next shift of measuring social impact, but then also governance of how there's an Indigenous voice that's integrated throughout a company's decision and discovery process to find a pathway forward, and also the existing corporate culture of the board, and how are companies measuring culture which is a big part of it. A lot of companies, I agree from the voluntary perspective that that's an issue because it isn't hitting the materiality assessment for companies or impacting investment under this existing framework. And if organizations are getting ready to plan for ESG today based off of those standards, get ready for future shifts because it is going to change to support where we need to go to impact a company's presence in the marketplace, social license, and then ultimately plans for reconciliation.
Alrighty, I'm just looking at the clock and it looks like our hour is coming to an end. So perhaps before we wrap things up, I'd like to turn to each of our speakers today, and I'll ask each of you to provide some concluding thoughts and remarks. And perhaps we can first start with Anne-Marie.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think I just want to maybe to re-mention how much we're starting our journey, and that a lot of us, a lot of mid-size companies and corporate Canada, we're just starting on our journey, our reconciliation journey, our net zero journeys. And really, I just want to encourage everyone to continue the conversation we're having today, and you know, we're just at the beginning, and I think every business should think about what they want to do on that side, and how they can start their own journey on reconciliation, and the way we can be meaningful and bold in what we're doing as a business and as business leaders.
Thanks for that. Turning over to you, Jason.
Yeah, I think on a I guess a key takeaway is, you know, the in the global economy, you know, there's Indigenous leaders that are also around the world watching what's happening in Canada and in other countries, in Australia or in New Zealand, related to how we advance with Indigenous people. So it is a big topic that impacts a company's reputation across the globe. And also from the investment standpoint, you see a lot of companies that have a lot of influence on society, and where we, you know, related to the comment I made earlier of directors being responsible to the corporation and to increasing shareholder wealth. Well, thinking about the values of society, because we see a lot of corporations that have more wealth than many countries that are challenged with GDP and so forth. So there's a big role for corporations to play in considering society's values and so forth. And for the reconciliation part of it, companies really need to be prepared to go on this journey and to commit to this journey and to understand it. And if there's not already that discussion happening, then certain boards and corporations are already behind the 8 ball on where things need to go. So I just wanted to leave that comment there from a reconciliation perspective, that if companies are considering this journey, they need to be ready. They need to have the right executive team that's ready to lead this and put the right commitment of having Indigenous peoples be a part of that journey with them to lead them into that pathway, so that there isn't any, I guess, inauthentic issues with it to be considered a branding play and so forth, that it really is part of a journey and that it exists within the culture of not just the board, but management, right to operational staff as well.
And I think that's a great note to end our discussion today on. So on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I would really like to extend my thanks to our speakers today and to Deloitte for partnering with us on this important discussion. Going forward, I'm happy to note that you can expect increasing chamber activity in this space, as we'll soon have a dedicated policy director joining our team to advance our work on Indigenous relations. So once again, thank you to Anne-Marie, thank you to Jason, and thank you to Deloitte, as well as our audience, for the great discussion today. And I hope everyone takes care. Until next time.